I stood at the front of a museum hall in Chicago, wearing a dress everyone assumed I could barely afford. While $18 million sat protected under my name, my mother watched from the first row with wet eyes. My guests whispered behind white roses, and Bennett Vale smiled like he had won. None of them knew I had hidden every company share, every account, every document that proved I was the richest person in that room. I had not come to that altar to become a wife yet. I had come to hear what a man said when he believed love had no money left. Bennett looked perfect under the soft gold lights. Polished shoes still, shoulders relaxed, face calm enough to fool anyone who had never watched him count people. I had watched him count me for months, not in kisses or promises, but in questions about ownership, inheritance, and what marriage would make available. Beside the vendor table, Elise Ward held a headset and pretended to check the floral timing, but her eyes stayed fixed on Bennett's mouth. That was how I knew the humiliation had been rehearsed, because she did not look nervous. She looked ready. The officiant had just moved toward the vows when Bennett lifted one hand, and the room obeyed him before I ever agreed to. "I need to tell the truth before this goes any further," he breathed. Gentle enough for strangers, sharp enough for me. My mother's fingers tightened around her program, and a few guests leaned forward, as if a ruined woman was more interesting than a married one. I stayed still because the worst part of betrayal is not always the wound. Sometimes it is watching everyone make space for the knife. Bennett turned slightly, giving the room his handsome profile, and I saw Elise angle her body toward a guest already holding up a phone. In that second, every ugly question he had asked me became evidence. Every cold pause became a receipt. Every polished smile became part of the same trap. I did not stop him, because stopping him would have saved a reputation he had already chosen over my dignity. So I let my almost husband open his mouth, and I waited for him to bury himself in front of everyone. I grew up in a Chicago family where money entered every room before anyone's name did, and I learned that lesson before I understood marriage. My mother, Della Ashby, funded private art galas where women kissed both cheeks, praised the diamonds first, then asked how she was sleeping. My father once appeared on finance magazine covers, but at dinner, people laughed harder at his smallest jokes when a deal had just closed. I watched affection become louder when accounts were full, and quieter when lawyers began standing near the door. That was why I never wanted to be inherited by a man who confused access with love, or comfort with devotion. I built my own company after years inside insurance data, auction disputes, and the ugly paperwork behind beautiful things wealthy people fought over. My platform verified digital asset records and private transaction histories for collectors, attorneys, insurers, and auction houses that could not afford one forged document. Nothing about it was gifted to me. Not the contracts, not the clients, not the nights I worked until sunrise over errors no one else saw. By the time Bennett Vale arrived, I was tired enough to mistake polish for peace, and my mother was hopeful enough to call him safe. He came from a respected event family, knew which wine paired with which donors, remembered small details, and never looked nervous around rich people. Della watched him pull out my chair one evening and whispered that a woman should not have to be powerful alone forever. I wanted to believe her, because loneliness can make even a careful woman want one clean answer. The first crack came quietly, buried inside questions that sounded practical until they kept returning to the same locked door. Bennett wanted to know how much my company was worth, whether my ownership was personal, and what marriage would make simpler between us. When I told him I had stepped away from family money and wanted a quieter life, his smile stayed, but warmth left his eyes. He brushed his thumb over his glass and answered, "Security matters. Marin. Love doesn't pay invoices," and the table suddenly felt colder than the wine. I did not accuse him that night, because accusations let guilty people rehearse better answers, and Bennett was already too good at sounding reasonable. Instead, I listened as he asked whether Della controlled anything for me, whether my father had structured a trust, whether pride was worth financial discomfort. Each question had a soft edge, but the shape was always the same, and it pointed toward whatever he thought I still owned. That was when I understood I could not ask whether he loved me, because only poverty, even fake poverty, would make him answer. I began the test with one sentence Bennett could not decorate: soften, or turn into something more convenient. Over dinner at a private club near the river, I told him I had signed away family support, refused any Ashby trust, and wanted marriage without inherited money between us. His fork stopped above the plate for less than a second, but I saw it, because disappointment has a body before it finds a voice. He recovered with a careful smile and touched my hand as if tenderness could hide calculation. Russell Dean had already made sure nothing about my silence crossed a legal line, because I was testing character, not forging a life. My assets remained protected as separate property. My company stayed under my control, and no document Bennett saw ever promised him access. I never asked him to sign anything false, never gave him fake records, and never trapped him inside a contract he did not understand. All I did was remove the prize he thought came with my last name, then wait to see what kind of man remained. For the first week, Bennett played devoted so well that even I hated how badly I wanted to believe him. Then the pressure slipped out in phrases that sounded like concern until they kept landing on the same bruise. "You should talk to Della again," he murmured after one dinner, already reaching for the check like generosity had become painful. When I reminded him I wanted peace more than family money, his mouth tightened, and he answered that pride was expensive for two people. Soon every conversation found its way back to what I supposedly no longer had, no matter where we began. If I mentioned a quiet apartment, Bennett called it smaller than the future we deserved. And if I mentioned fewer events, he mentioned vendor bills. He never asked whether simplicity made me happy. He asked whether I understood how fast respect disappeared without money behind it. That was when I stopped mistaking his anxiety for ambition, because every fear he named ended with my mother's checkbook. Elise Ward became visible in the cracks Bennett thought I was too polite to inspect. She appeared at tastings, fittings, and vendor calls with a headset, smiling like a professional while watching him like a woman waiting for her turn. Bennett introduced her as a branding consultant, but Elise knew too much about my alleged poverty and too little about floral timing. When she joked that old families always forgave the useful daughter, Bennett laughed before remembering I was standing there. Owen Vale noticed what everyone else politely ignored, and he did not wrap the truth in charm. One afternoon, Bennett pushed again, asking why I would not let Della help us build the right life, and Owen looked up from across the table. "If she says no, why do you keep hearing maybe?" he asked, calm enough to make the room uncomfortable. I looked at him then, really looked, because he had defended my boundary without knowing it protected millions. Bennett did not plan to simply leave me. He planned to make the room believe he had escaped me. That was the first thing Russell Dean understood when a vendor thread landed in his inbox with Bennett's message still attached. The wording was too careful to be anger, too public to be panic, and too polished to be accidental. Bennett wanted a witness list, a clean villain, and a ruined bride everyone would discuss before dessert. Elise Ward had given him the shape of it, because humiliation was useless to her unless someone recorded it. She moved through tastings and floor plans with vendor confidence, but her questions were never about centerpieces or timing. She wanted to know where guests would stand, which side had better light, and how quickly gossip pages picked up private scandals. In one draft caption, later saved by Russell, she wrote that old families could always smell desperation before the bride reached the aisle. Bennett needed the story because his family company was bleeding quietly behind rented silver, late invoices, and vendors waiting for checks. If he married money, he survived. If I truly had none, he needed the room to believe I had deceived him first. Elise wanted my place beside him. But she wanted something uglier too. A scandal polished into proof of her branding genius. Together, they turned my wedding into a stage where Bennett would call himself honorable for discarding a woman he thought was broke. Russell warned me not to touch anything that belonged to them. Not a phone. Not a password. Not a locked account. The evidence came because Bennett was careless with arrogance. Copying the wrong people. Talking on calls where I was present. And leaving unpaid vendors nervous. One afternoon, Russell slid printed pages toward me and kept his voice low, explaining that truth was useful only if it stayed clean. You can protect yourself, Marin, he cautioned, but do not become reckless just because they are cruel. Della still thought I was turning fear into a test too close to the wedding, and her worry hurt more than Bennett's suspicion. She folded her hands over a museum seating chart and asked whether love deserved a chance before I punished it. I looked at the names placed around our tables, then at my mother's careful handwriting beside Bennett's family. If a man only wanted me when my last name came with money, I would rather learn it at the altar than in divorce court. The museum hall looked expensive enough to forgive anything, and Bennett had chosen it for that reason. White roses climbed stone columns, champagne waited untouched, and every guest seemed ready to mistake cruelty for class. Bennett stood beside me with calm shoulders, perfect face, then lifted one hand before the vows. The officiant stopped. The room softened into silence, but I saw Elise Ward angle her headset toward the first phone. Bennett looked at the guests before he looked at me, and that choice told the truth before his mouth did. I cannot marry a woman who lied about who she is, he began, gentle enough to sound wounded. Della rose from the first row so quickly her program bent, but shock held her voice behind her teeth. A few people leaned closer, not because they cared about me, but because Scandal had entered wearing a white dress. Marin has no inheritance, no family support, and no future I can build on, he continued, each word dressed as sorrow. Someone whispered behind me. Another person laughed, and the sound spread faster than decency could stop it. I heard the shift happen, when guests stopped seeing a bride and started pricing a woman they thought had lost value. Elise stood near the vendor table with her chin lifted. Not surprised. Not confused. Only waiting. Bennett turned toward me then, handsome and pitiless, and delivered the sentence he thought would finish me. I will not spend my life carrying someone broke, he said. And Della finally breathed my name through the silence. I did not cry, because crying would have given them a cleaner story than the one Bennett exposed. The pain was real, but so was the evidence. Elise angled toward the phone. Bennett performing. My mother, frozen, with bent paper. Owen Vale stepped forward before anyone else found courage, and his anger did not need volume. You do not get to humiliate her because she trusted you, he said. Looking at Bennett like family name meant nothing. Bennett laughed, then glanced between us, as if kindness had become something cheap enough to mock. If you feel so protective, stand with her, he answered, and the room went quiet for a different reason. Owen did not make me a spectacle, did not touch me, and did not turn my humiliation into his moment. He moved closer and kept his eyes on Bennett, steady enough that the silence around us changed shape. She should not stand alone while you pretend cruelty is honesty, Owen said, and I finally turned toward the man I almost married. You were right about one thing, I told Bennett, letting every guest hear the steadiness he expected to steal. I did hide the truth, but not because I was poor. You failed the only test money could not help you pass. Russell Dean moved only after Bennett's final sentence had settled over the room like broken glass. He did not rush, did not raise his voice, and did not make the moment larger than the documents already made it. From the side aisle, he opened a black folder thick enough to change the temperature of every face watching me. Bennett saw Russell before the guests understood him. and the color left his mouth first. Russell confirmed only what was necessary, because real power does not empty its whole safe to prove a point. My company existed under my ownership. My assets were separate property before marriage, and no Ashby trust had ever been needed to make me wealthy. A few guests shifted in their chairs as if posture could erase the laughter they had given Bennett minutes earlier. Della stared at me with one hand pressed to her chest, finally understanding that I had not hidden poverty from anyone. I had hidden money to see who would still recognize me without it, and Bennett had answered in front of everyone. He tried to speak, but Russell's folder had already turned his performance into a record. The man who wanted to judge me at the altar now stood inside the judgment he created. I looked toward Elise, still near the vendor table, and watched her lower the headset like it had suddenly become evidence. Elise was never just handling branding. I told the room, keeping my voice calm enough to make denial look childish. Russell held the pages without reading private details aloud, but the meaning landed anyway through draft captions, media notes, and timing messages. She had planned for guests to record Bennett calling me broke, then sell the story as his escape from a desperate bride. One older client of hers rose without a word, took her purse, and walked out before Elise could smile. That quiet exit did more damage than shouting would have, because people like Elise lived on rooms that kept inviting them back. Bennett turned on me then, calling the whole thing a setup, as if I had placed cruelty in his mouth. I did not move closer, because he had already given me every inch of ground I needed. "I did not make you humiliate me," I answered, watching his jaw tighten before the guests did. "I did not make you call me broke, and I did not make your mistress stand beside the vendor list." I continued. The words stayed clean because every sentence had proof sitting right behind it. A supplier near the back asked quietly whether the Vail account would be settled before the evening continued. That was when Bennett's perfect room changed sides. Not with applause, but with contracts. Phones lowered, and hands no longer reaching for his. Bennett did not lose everything in one dramatic crash. He lost it the way men like him fear most, quietly and publicly. 2 gala clients ended their contracts with the Vail Company before the weekend closed, and his family removed him from operations before vendors demanded more answers. Elise Ward's draft story never reached the gossip pages, because the clients who saw her leave that room stopped answering her calls. Russell's letters made the clipped videos disappear before strangers could turn my humiliation into entertainment without the truth attached. Della apologized without trying to make herself the wounded one, and that mattered more than any perfect speech could have. She withdrew funding from an event tied to Bennett's circle, then sat across from me and admitted she had mistaken polish for safety. I forgave her slowly, not because mothers deserve instant grace, but because she finally stopped asking me to choose comfort over evidence. For the first time, my name felt lighter without needing the Ashby money to hold it up. Owen did not become my groom that night, because I was not a vacancy waiting for a better man to fill. He walked me out, kept his hands to himself, and asked whether I wanted silence before anyone demanded strength from me again. Months later, when the noise was gone, we built something quiet enough to feel real and steady enough to survive daylight. I kept my company, my dignity, and the peace Bennett never knew how to price. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story, especially if some part of it reminded you of a choice you once had to make. Tell me where you are watching from, and share what peace, self-respect, or real love means to you now.